Let's take out our Bibles and learn together. There's many words that we can use to describe God. God is faithful. God is a God of providence. And what does that mean? Well, those two things, God is faithful and God is a God of providence, means this, that God is going to be faithful to his promises, and through his providence, he has already began to work, to arrange, to place in order those things that we need in order that his will be done. And what I want you to realize is this: some of the things that we may not see significance in, we may not be aware that this is God. He's put us in this situation. He's provided this. He's the one that allowed this to be. And he's done so because he knew our future. He knew always that one day we would be in this situation. And therefore he provided something that we have maybe been negligent of, that we have not been mindful of, that we have not thanked him for. He has done that in order to be used for that moment. And this is exactly what we're going to see in the life of Paul. Now, we have been studying in the book of Acts for several months, and now we're ready for Acts chapter 22, the second half. We began this chapter last week, and we want to continue on to its conclusion this week. And Paul, he has turned into Jerusalem. He was in other places, and he has moved back to Jerusalem. And we see that there was a desire among Paul to oftentimes be in Jerusalem for festivals, God's appointed time, and also for him to worship God in the temple in Jerusalem. So we need to see a right understanding of Paul's mindset, Paul's behavior, and what the scripture reviews in his life for us. What the scripture emphasizes and repeats in his life for us. So look with me, as I said, Acts chapter 22, and we're going to begin where we left off last week in verse 17. Paul, he has been arrested. People have not understood what he's done. People have provided false information. And now Paul is arrested, but he's giving his defense. He's reminding the people of who he is and what has transpired in his life when Messiah revealed himself on that way to Damascus. So he's speaking, and notice what he says in verse 17. And it came about when I turned into Jerusalem, and I was praying in the temple. So Paul is speaking about this experience, that he was in Jerusalem, in the temple, and as we saw, he was going through a instruction based upon what the leadership, the believing community told him to do. To go through and follow this instruction from the Torah in regard to individuals who were under the Nazirite vow. Paul had done that. He was working with these individuals, bringing them to the conclusion of this vow. When he was falsely accused of doing other things. And this caused a great commotion in the temple area to the extent that Paul was arrested. And now he's making his defense. And he says here in verse 17, he reminds them that he turned into Jerusalem. He went into the temple to pray like any other God-fearing individual would do. And notice the last part, it says, and it happened when I was in a trance. Now, that's how many Bibles translate that word, trance. But the word is really where we get in English. If we just said the Greek word, you know what it sounds like? Ecstasy. And what Paul is speaking about is the joy, the satisfaction from being intimate from being in God's presence. And he's talking about being a recipient of revelation from him. So he was praying, but we see something. We see that what was affirmed to Paul on that road to Damascus, that is, by that experience, when he was actually in Damascus and, as we talked about, was with this man Ananias, Paul is recapping it here. And what is that? Well, look again at verse 17, the whole verse. And it came about as I turned into Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I became in ecstasy, in this spiritual condition. And he says, and saw him speaking to me. And what did he say? Well, notice it. Messiah is speaking, and he says, make haste and go forth quickly from Jerusalem. So here Paul is, and the same one who appeared to him on that road to Damascus. What we find here is that things are being spoken to him, and there's something new and something old. What's the new thing? Well, what's being said here? When we look at this verse, Messiah is saying, depart quickly, make haste, and leave Jerusalem. Why? Because he said, because they will not receive your testimony concerning me. Who's the me? Yeshua. So this relationship that began on the road of Damascus, and this calling that Paul received through Ananias in Damascus, Messiah is once again, when Paul is in Jerusalem, they're praying and worshiping and following the framework of worship. God gives revelation. And Messiah tells him, you need to make haste. You need to depart quickly from this place because they are not going to receive your testimony concerning me. Verse 19. And I said, Lord, they understand. Now this is a word for perceiving something, knowing something. And it is a word that means literally to stand upon. So there's a foundation for this. What is being said is based upon something. They know this to be true because there's something that establishes this point. Look again. Verse 19, Paul says, and I say, Lord, that they know that I was imprisoning and beating each synagogue, that is, in each synagogue, the ones who were believing in you. So Paul's reminding, they know who I was. They understand my, what we could call former life, pre-salvation experience, where he says, I was going, we talked about this last week, receiving letters of authority from the high priest, how he could go and imprison people. And then the next word is a word for, well, we would say in Hebrew, makot, striking. It's punishing them. So it's referring to arresting them, imprisoning them, and placing punishment upon them. He's saying all these people that have had me arrested, that are against me, they know what I was, how I went and arrested people and had them punished from each of the synagogues of those that were believing in you. Now this says something. We are told here, and there's no debate about this. This is not a matter of interpretation. Let me just pause for a moment. Is that all too often people will hear Scripture and say, well, that's how you interpret it. When it's not a matter of interpretation, it is a statement that speaks for itself. And what are we told here? That there were those in synagogues who were believers. And who would that have been? Well, for the most part, those from the Jewish community. And that's why Paul was being oppressed and persecuted, because there were indeed, and we'll see this later on, there were indeed many believers, many believers from the Jewish community. So Paul says they know that I imprisoned people, that I had them punished, that I went from each of the synagogues, taking out those who were believing in you. Verse 20. And when the blood of Stephen, your servant, was poured out. Now, he uses a word that in my opinion, has some offering implications, giving or a sacrificial sense. Now, what I mean here is that Stephen offered up his life as a sacrifice, not for sin, but some sacrifices are those that are offered in thanksgiving, in praise, in response to the work that God has already done. So Paul is saying, and he uses this word in a very significant way, that when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was poured out, was offered up, and that's exactly what Stephen did out of faith. So he says, furthermore, I was there when the blood of Stephen, your servant, was poured out. And he says, and was standing and giving approval. And it means that he agreed with, he gave approval with the ones who were killing him. And I kept the garments of the one who killed him. So when Stephen was being put to death, Paul says, I was there. I'm the one, as we already know, that held the garments. I gave approval while he was being put to death and while those were killing him. Now move to verse 21. And he said to me, go, because I, for faraway nations, will send you. Now, I read it in the order of the text. Now, we might say in English, go forth, for I am sending you to faraway nations. But the emphasis here in the word order is faraway nations. So Paul has been chosen by God, and this goes along with what Ananias said in Damascus when he kind of prophesied over Paul when Paul prayed and regained his sight. We see that he was given a purpose, a commandment, a charge to do. So Paul is simply testifying what Messiah has said to him in regard to his purpose. Now, there's another thing that needs to be borne out, and that is that there was a desire to see Paul be done away with because they didn't like his message, not only to the Jewish community, but to the Gentile community. And that was simply this, that God was pouring out his grace upon the Gentiles, with them being Gentiles and not having converted to become Jews. See, the problem was this. If you were to go back 2,000 years, and if you were to ask a leader within Judaism, will God bless and will God do things for the nations, for the Gentiles? You know what they would say? Only if they become a Jew first. Only through conversion. It's only through becoming a Jew can we have access to the promises, the blessings, the purposes, the benefits of a covenantal relationship with God. What Paul was saying was, no, Messiah, he is the leader and redeemer of a covenant which is for all flesh. And so many times in the scripture we see that term kol basar, all flesh, being used in regard to the promises of God. That God is taking people out of every nation, from every tribe, every language, every people group, and bringing them into a kingdom people, a family of God. They don't have to become Jewish first, meaning the promises of God are not only for the Jewish people. And Paul was teaching that, There was evidence of that. We talked about that at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. We see this in other places through the ministry of Peter and what happened to him and other apostles. So it was established, but they didn't like it. Why? Very simply, because they did not understand prophetic truth. James, when he spoke, he says, what's happening with the Gentiles is exactly what we should anticipate because of what the prophets taught, what the prophets revealed. And here's the problem. When we look at Judaism in the past and presently, it is because of being prophetically illiterate that they don't understand what God's up to. And may I say to believers that if we don't understand prophetic truth, if we're ignorant of the revelation of prophecy, we're going to not understand and in a similar way miss out, be opposed to, be living against what God is up to. We won't have the prophetic vantage point to understand the last days, what God's up to. So look on now to verse 22. Paul has said these words, and there's a response. Verse 22. And hearing, meaning they were listening to him, they heard him up until this word. And when they heard this word, notice what they did. They lifted up their voices saying, and the word here is literally lift up. And notice the context because it's an important word. It says here, lift from the ground this one. Now, this is very informative. Realize something. What's going on here is a type of trial. Paul is making a defense. And now the Jewish leadership, but they're not alone. There are also, and we'll see this in the second part of our study, all of this is being done under the auspices of the Roman Empire. They are there. There are Romans officials. So when this phrase is used, lift him up from the ground, it is a reference to crucifixion. And we see something, and this is not debatable. The leadership here, in the same way, and we're not talking about the Jewish people, but we're talking about the leaders of the Jewish people. They wanted, just like they wanted Yeshua to be put to death by crucifixion, because of its horrible punishment, because of its testimony. It is a very public punishment of death. They also wanted, there's no other way that we can understand this phrase in the middle of verse 22 when it says, ere apo tis gis tun toi uton, which means lift up from the ground this one. Why? For it is not fit, that is, he is not fit to live. So it's very clear here that they want Paul put to death, being lifted up from the ground, an idiom for crucifixion. Now let's stop for a moment and think about this from Paul's standpoint. Here Paul is obedient to God. He's going from place to place, discipling, encourage, training new believers, and sharing that message, bringing others to that saving faith. And he's doing it for the most part in faraway places, exactly what the scripture said and prophesied that he would do. Now he's coming back to Jerusalem, and he's worshiping God. And he's helping other people who are under a vow, a Torah vow from the book of Numbers, for them to complete and carry out this vow in a Torah observant way. Why do I say that? Well, the temple was standing, and you can read what it said earlier on in the previous chapter. So all of this Paul is doing out of obedience. There's nothing that he's done in Jerusalem that is beyond question, out of the ordinary, against the traditions and the laws of Judaism. Paul is acceptable in the sense that what he did in this carrying out of the Nazirite vow, it was according to the Torah. Being there in the temple worshiping, no problem with anything that he has done. but he's being falsely accused of bringing those into places where, according to tradition, not the law, they should not be. And therefore, they're using that as a pretext for what? For making charges against him. And now they're trying to rally up support for Paul being put to death. And all Paul has done is obeyed God, God's call on his life. So notice they say he's not fit to live. Verse 23. And they crying out and ripping the garments. Now, this is the word ripteo in Greek. It's where we get the English word rip. So they rip the garments, and they kick up dust, cast up dust into the air. Now, all of that is to share how out of control they are. They have become a mob. And this is very important that we see it. Very similar, and this is why Stephen is mentioned earlier on. They are out of control and they want to see Paul crucified. And they're in this commotion. And that's what we see at the end of verse 23. They're casting dust up into the air, verse 24. But there's someone there. Notice it is a commander, and the word here means a ruler of 1,000. So he has at his disposal, he has authority of at least 1,000 people. Can be more, but at least 1,000 people. We're going to meet a centurion as well. That is someone who has authority over at least 100 people, up to 999. Then this next one would be his commander. So we have important Roman officials there that we're going to meet in this last part of chapter 22. And this simply confirms what we're saying is that this is not simply a meeting of the Sanhedrin, although the Sanhedrin's there. It is also a meeting that's being conducted under the auspices of the Roman Empire. Look again at verse 24. And the captain, he commanded him that he should be brought into the citadel. Now, why was that? Well, outside, there was this mob ruling. There was chaos. There was this uprising, that old English word, brouhaha, taking place. And he wanted to remove Paul from the masses, from the public, and bring him into the citadel so that things can be done properly according to the Roman way of doing things. Now, remember what I said earlier? That God can use anything. Is it good that there's a Roman Empire ruling over Israel? No. Is God using that to punish? Perhaps. And secondly, we see something else. God is going to use that in order to preserve Paul. Now, he could have done it a multiplicity of ways. We've seen in the scripture, there was times when they wanted to stone Messiah, throw him over a cliff in Nazareth. And God just intervened in a supernatural way. And Yeshua left right through the midst of them walking. He became hidden from them. So God's able, but God can also use natural circumstances. And many times he's the author, that he's put into place these natural things. So God's man at this time is this captain, this Roman leader. And he leads Paul out of that mass, and it says into the citadel. Some Bibles will say castle. And he gave an order. He wanted information, so he first said for him to be flogged. That would be a very painful thing to go through. We know about flogging. You have that stick with leather straps, and in those leather straps are pieces of metal, glass, bone, whatever, in order to beat your flesh and rip it open. So he says to have him flogged, and also there's another word which has to do with being integrated. that is to be examined, would be an easier word for me to say, to be examined. But here's something very important. Two words, the word flogged and the word examine. And this word examine, more often than not, implies in a torturous way. So they are going to punish Paul by having him flogged. And then secondly, they are going to torture him in order to get the information that they want. And how do we know that? In order, look at the last part of verse 24, in order that he might know on account of the reason that thus they were lifting up their voices concerning him. So this captain, Roman official, he comes in and sees this brouhaha, this uprising, this mob action. And he knows it has something to do with him, Paul. So he says, we know how to get information. Flog him, that'll show him how serious we are. And then interrogate him by torture in order that I hear everything I want to hear about him. Now, the captain, this one over 1,000, is giving the orders, but notice what happens. Look now to verse 25. And when they had bound him in belts and in some type of like leather garments, they bound him, and the centurion, Paul spoke to the centurion. So he had been bound, and the implication is he's been bound now in order to be flogged. And the centurion's coming, just like we see with Yeshua in the gospel. There was a centurion there to oversee this flogging. And notice what happens. After they had bound him with these straps, Paul said to the centurion standing, if a Roman man, and that one being uncondemned, is it lawful for you to flog? So he hasn't been flogged yet. That's what's getting ready to do. And Paul simply says, I have a question for you, Mr. Centurion. Is it lawful, according to Roman law, for a Roman man who's been uncondemned, he's Roman and he's been uncondemned, can you flog him? Now, a Jewish individual that was not a Roman citizen, that's what he means by Roman man, one who has citizenship. See, a Jew or someone who's not a Roman citizen, they could just flog him. They could do whatever. But he's not been condemned. So a Roman citizen you can, but there's a process. You have to have a trial which condemns him. So Paul says, is it lawful for you to take a Roman citizen and one that's not yet been condemned and to flog him? And we see here that when the centurion heard this, he went and he proclaimed to that captain, saying, he spoke to that captain over 1,000, watch out what you are doing. Now, the centurion, he's just taking orders, but he realizes what Paul says is factual under Roman law, their protocol. So the centurion stops. He goes back to his captain, this ruler over 1,000, and he says, watch out, be careful, because of what you are about to do. For this man is Roman, meaning he's a Roman citizen. And that changes everything. So it is very providential for a variety of reasons that God has chosen Paul, being a Pharisee, being trained perfectly in Jewish law, knowing Jewish tradition, knowing the traditions of the elders, having that background. Paul was not someone that they could kind of pull the wool over his eyes. He understood better what Judaism was saying. And the fact that he was a Roman citizen allowed him passage through places, and also the privileges of a Roman citizen. And that is no condemnation until one is on trial and is proved guilty. So when the commander heard this, look at verse 27. The commander went before Paul and said to him, Tell me, are you a Roman? And notice he says, yes. And the captain answered, he's also a Roman. But notice something. He's got this position, but he was a Roman citizen through a different means. He says, a great sum, I acquired this citizenship. So he says, with a great sum, and this means money. With a great sum, I acquired this Roman citizenship. What he's trying to say to Paul is, I know the value of it. I know there's benefits to it. And being one who paid a lot of money to get it, it's because I have respect for it. And what does Paul say? Well, Paul says to him, look at the end of verse 28. But Paul said, I also was born, meaning in contrast to you purchasing it, I was born as a Roman citizen. So Paul is saying, you purchased it, but it's natural to me. Now, both are equal, but there was just seeming a preference if you were born into a Roman citizen position. And that's what Paul was. Here again, God's providence to have him being a Roman citizen. Therefore, immediately they went away from him. So immediately they departed from him, the ones who were about to flog him. So once they heard that he was a Roman citizen, born a Roman citizen, the ones who were about to take and flog him and then to interrogate him, what happened? They immediately departed because it was against Roman law to do that. To flog him, to interrogate someone who had not yet been condemned, or there was not orders given to do this in a proper way. Now look, if you would, to verse 29 again. We see here, immediately therefore they went away from him, those that were about to flog him. And the commander, he became afraid. He knew that he was a Roman, and therefore, and that he had also been bound. Now, why was that? Well, because now being bound like that was a humiliation. And he was greatly afraid. Why? Before he'd done anything, he should know who he's dealing with. And he did not. He just assumed, this is this Jewish guy, I can do what I want with him. But even though Paul was Jewish, he was born a Roman citizen. Again, a sign of God's providential activity in the life of Paul. All these things prepared Paul for what he was going to have to do. It positioned Paul in a place of preference, that he would not be treated in a way that lacked any rights or privileges by the Roman Empire. Now let's go to our last verse, verse 30. And on the next day, wanting to know absolutely why the Jewish individuals, the Judeans, those from Judeans, had accused him. He wanted to know what it was all about. And he freed him from these bonds, and he commanded that the high priest and the entire Sanhedrin, their entire Sanhedrin, come. So now they want to know the leader of the Roman government for this matter, this leader over 1,000. He says, I want to know something. I want the high priests for him to come. And I want the entire Sanhedrin, their entire Sanhedrin brought before me. Because I want to get to the bottom of this matter. And what I want to say is this. Paul is given opportunity to testify. Exactly what Ananias said. That you are going to prophesy. and speak and reveal truth before kings and leaders in many nations. And this is all being fulfilled. And we see God's providence, we see his faithfulness, and we see how God delivers those who are serving him from whatever circumstances they may be in order that God's will might be accomplished. Look again at verse 30. On the next day, desiring or wanting, and this is a word of strength, of intensity. He really wanted to know absolutely for what reason that the Jewish leadership had charged Paul. And he loosened him from the bonds, and he commanded that the high priest and all their Sanhedrin come and to bring Paul, and he stand him before them. So now what we're seeing is there's going to be another opportunity for Paul to testify. Testify, and don't you see God's plan in all of this? For Paul to speak truth, to testify, to give revelation that he had received to them. Who? To the high priests, to all the Sanhedrin, concerning the truth of Messiah Yeshua, that they might be brought to a right understanding. That is the potential. That is what God is doing. Now, I want to conclude with this. I think it's so important that we understand God taking his truth and giving it to people, presenting it to them, making them aware of it. And all that speaks of God's faithfulness. God is true to get his message. And we see that, for example, in a great scripture from the book of Matthew, chapter 24 and verse 14. That before the end comes, what do we know? That this gospel of the kingdom must be shared, testified, must be proclaimed to all the nations. So God is faithful to get his word out. And he's using Paul to do that to the Jewish community and to the non-Jewish community, in order that all people might come to faith. Will all people come to faith? No, they will not. But it won't be because of God's failure, God forbid, in any way. God is faithful, he is true, and let all the world be condemned. Because God is righteous. And if we do not embrace his righteousness and the way to be justified, that is being declared righteous by his grace, if we don't embrace that, what's the outcome? Condemnation. And God is not a respecter of people. When you say let all the world be condemned, that is anyone, doesn't matter who, what language, what color of skin, what nation, nothing matters. If you reject that gospel, you are going to be condemned. Makes no difference, anything else. You receive it, you are justified by his grace. You will have eternity in his kingdom. You reject it, and you will be eternally condemned. There is no position in between. Well, I'll close with that until next week. May God richly bless you. And I'll close with shalom from Israel.